interesting story you have. Give me a little background on Recon and what you're all about.
Sure. We're looking for underexplored areas in the world with the potential for large discoveries of oil and gas. In particular, we noted how the shale revolution has changed things so much in the oil and gas industry in the United States and in Canada, and to a lesser extent Argentina and Australia. But the opportunities for those sorts of discoveries exist all over the world. And Namibia came out very high on that list. A very large basin in the northeast corner called the Okavango Basin. We took a license for that area, and now we're moving ahead to explore it.
What ReconAfrica is coming to do in Namibia is ecocide and genocide. Our San people, they are foragers. The food will be taken away from them. So ReconAfrica can reap profits. To what extent do our lives matter that we have to put ourselves on the front line so we can continue fighting this injustice that is being perpetuated onto our people, onto indigenous people all over the globe? What did we do to deserve this injustice? The fossil fuel industry is busy invading our homes. If these practices go on, there won't be a planet left.
Hello, can you hear me? Sorry. Yes. Hi, everyone. Apologies for that. Thank you all for joining. My name is Alejandra, and I will be presenting with you once more. In this episode, we're speaking live with Jojo Mehta. She's the co-founder of Stop Ecocide, and we're going to hear about the very important work that she's doing and learn about it. But before we hear from her, I'd like to show you a short video that was just sent to us by Fridays for Future protesters in Namibia.
Dear world, we are Fridays for Future Windhoek, Namibia. We'd like to tell you a story about how history is repeating itself and how together we can stop it.
A Canadian and US company, ReconAfrica, has snuck past our doors and brought with them potential environmental destruction to our pristine ecosystems in the Okavango. They have come to exercise their addiction to fossil fuels with plans to scout and drill for oil and gas in our lands.
ReconAfrica's licensed area overlaps with 6 locally managed wildlife reserves,
a UNESCO World Heritage Site,
and will affect the Okavango Delta.
The Okavango region is home to the largest herd of African elephants left on the planet.
endangered African wild dogs,
Population of lions, leopards, giraffes, birds, and rare flora.
not to mention, it will hinder the local conservation efforts.
ReconAfrica is limiting our already declining carbon budget and is crippling the global efforts to move away from fossil fuels.
We should not allow them to destroy such a globally important conservation area under the guise of economic development.
Fight with us by sharing our petitions and tell the Namibian, US, and Canadian government that this is unacceptable.
Help stop neocolonialism. Do not let history repeat itself like with the Niger Delta.
Save the Okavango Delta.
Save the Niger Delta.
Save our African deltas.
Well, I hope you all felt really as inspired by that video as I just did right now. As you probably know, this series, this live stream series, is in support of a group comprised of members of the local Koe and San communities who are walking miles to the Namibian embassy Cape Town to protest and take a stand against the drilling of the Okavango Delta. This walk began a week ago today, actually, and it's been, they've been walking all alongside the southern coast of South Africa. And all throughout the journey, the walkers have had immense support and love and solidarity by loads of groups of people, including local indigenous organizations, religious communities, and even a wildlife refuge. And Nili, before I talk to Jojo, we have a final video from Ina, which we met her in the last, the first live stream we did and the second one, and we hope that she can finally join us live in our final episode on Wednesday. But here you go.
How is it possible that these companies have rights to World Heritage sites? Don't we have rights to our water? How can they come such an activity in a desert? How many more homes do you want to sacrifice? How many more people will have to die? How many more people will have to put themselves in the front line so they can fight off these criminals? COP26. This is not about who is making the most of the money. This is about who is surviving and who is not. Your borders are shutting down. You don't want us anymore, and yet your companies are coming to cause devastations on our side of the planet because of the fossil fuels. COP26, this is a matter of survival. And if anything happens to me, if anything happens to the Okavango Delta, everyone that sits in that convention will be responsible. The blood will be on your hands. Stop the fossil fuels.
Well, hello, finally to you, Jojo. We're very glad to have you here with us today and hear all about, the campaign and the work that you've been doing it. But yeah, so hello, welcome. And can you talk to us a bit about what is Ecocide and how did it come along into being?
Hi, Alejandra. It's really great to be here. And I'm particularly excited about this conversation because this whole issue of fracking is precisely how I got into doing this work. I was very involved in the anti-fracking community in the UK. And I think, although most of my life I was probably a kind of what you might call an armchair activist, kind of clicking petitions and, maybe sending the odd letter to my elected representative and so on. But the thing that really kind of got me up out of that chair and onto the streets was when I discovered about fracking. And that was back in 2013, I think, when, it had been underway in the US for a while, but was really nobody knew about it here in the UK. I was having this conversation with my housemates about it and with my family. And my little daughter was 5 at the time. And she burst into tears and she said, "Mummy, I don't understand. If they're poisoning the water and they're poisoning the ground, surely they realise that they're going to be poisoning themselves as well. You have to call them. You have to call them and tell them to stop now." And I remember thinking, well, what difference is it going to make if I just pick up the phone to one of these big companies? And she had just come with me just a couple of weeks before to the local election. So she'd been to the ballot box and she said, "But Mum, can't you talk to the voting man?" And so I found myself talking to our local MP, who was a classic sort of slippery politician who avoided every every question that I came up with. And I just came out of there thinking that is never going to happen again. I'm going to inform myself and I'm going to do something about this. And that is how I came into the whole arena of environmental campaigning and started giving talks and doing surveys and even produced leaflets that went all over the UK, into the anti-fracking communities all over the UK when the UK government was wanting to frack here. And I think that what these anti-fracking protesters are doing in Africa with this big walk is hugely, hugely important, because our situation in the UK over the subsequent years has really, really shown that taking action at the grassroots is hugely impactful. Raising awareness and ultimately in preventing these industries. So I'm really, really delighted to be here. And it was through that work that I actually met Polly Higgins, who is no longer with us, very sadly. And we became very close friends. I spent the last 4.5 years of her life with her, working around environmental activism and on her side with the ecocide, criminalising of ecocide. And we founded the Stop Ecocide campaign together in 2017 in response to really, you know, the work that Polly was doing, trying to bring this forward diplomatically, the idea of making mass damage and destruction of ecosystems into a crime, but finding that it was difficult to get funding for it, and that people found it either too extreme or too risky as something to support. And so bringing together kind of the campaigning side of things, which I was very involved in, and the legal side of things, which was her expertise, we launched this campaign together to kind of crowdfund, if you like, for the diplomatic work to move this forward politically. And so that's how it kind of came into being. And since then, it's been growing hugely. And I think probably it's also hugely relevant that XRISN are hosting this series as well, because in Polly's last week of her life it was the rebellion in London in 2019 in April, and even though she'd been talking about this and, you know, spreading the word amongst the legal and political and all sorts of communities around the world for a number of years, it was the first time that she actually saw this hitting the streets. So this was over London in Extinction Rebellion, April 2019, and it really brought the whole concept of ecocide to the streets. And it was really beautiful that she got to see that in those last few days before she died. So yeah, it was quite a journey.
Yeah. And what is it like right now? What is the work, you know, that you get involved? Like what challenges are you finding at the moment? I think how has it been for you, I guess, being part of this journey?
It's been quite an amazing experience in many ways. A bit of a roller coaster, certainly. I mean, there was this feeling when Polly got ill, she had a very fast and aggressive cancer. She was only given 6 weeks, and I think she lasted about a month of that. It was so fast. And there were so many people. She had a really strong personal following, and lots of people contacted us saying, you know, what's going to happen to this work, you know, when she goes. And actually what actually happened was quite remarkable, in that there was a huge upsurge of support. So where before, and sometimes I think this happens when when a particular cause is really championed by one name or one person, sometimes people almost feel like, well, they're dealing with that, so I don't need to. You know, it was like, oh, that's Polly Higgins' thing, so she's obviously, you know, busy doing that. And, you know, people didn't necessarily realize that, you know, we'd been working, you know, without a salary for years just to get this thing moving forward. But once she wasn't there, suddenly there was this kind of, well, this is too important, this can't stop, you know, we have to help move this forward. And actually what's been very inspiring over the last nearly 2 years now, is realizing that other lawyers, other associations, you know, environmental groups, and people, you know, in different parts of the world were all really keen, and often they were inspired by Polly, but really keen to work together on this. And so this has been a massive dot joining exercise of really, you know, bringing together the voices that have been working, you know, hugely hard in or sometimes in other countries, or, you know, in their own areas, and really creating a movement behind this. And that's what's really been happening over the last couple of years.
Yeah, that's really great to hear. So I understand that this campaign is about making essentially the destruction of the natural environment a crime, right?
Absolutely. Okay. So the idea is not completely new, and Polly specifically, and our campaign has continued to aim for the top level of criminalisation, for making this a crime at the international level, at the International Criminal Court, and you know, there are a number of reasons for that. I mean, we're all aware that there are serious levels of destruction happening to nature around the world, but in different areas. It could be, you know, the seabed, which is being, you know, just raped by bottom trawling. It could be the Amazon rainforest, you know, being destroyed in order to grow beef or soya. You know, there are a number of different areas that everybody's kind of aware that these problems are happening, but the concept of ecocide kind of brings them all together as a kind of, you know, this is serious damage and destruction. And interestingly, when the International Criminal Court was first being brought into being, and there was the draft to the Rome Statute, what became the Rome Statute, which is the governing document of that court. When that was being devised, there was originally a plan to have an article in there for serious environmental damage, but it got dropped, and it got dropped before the statute became ratified, and so it never made it into the sort of the list of serious crimes. And the list ended up being just 3 crimes: war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity at the time. So in 1998. And what we know is that we don't know exactly how it was dropped, because there's no evidence that there was a vote, but we are aware that there were certain countries that expressed an objection to having environmental crimes in there, and the UK was one of those. So was the US, France, the Netherlands, and at one occasion also Brazil. And what's interesting is, well, those are all oil states for a start, in one way or another, but also at the time there was quite a lot of development of nuclear testing also in those countries. And of course it's very difficult to imagine nuclear weapon being anything other than ecocidal, and so potentially there are some reasons why that didn't make the final draft. But really what the movement is now aiming to do, in a sense, how we feel it, is we're kind of replacing or putting in place a crime that should have been there in the first place. And if you think about it, if mass destruction of ecosystems had been illegal for the last 20 years, we'd be living in a very different world already now. And so, it's long overdue, if you like. And I think people often don't realize, because it feels quite intuitively that this is a crime, that to destroy nature to this kind of extent that we're seeing is criminal. People often don't realize that it's not, that actually in most parts of the world there isn't a crime per se of ecosystem destruction level. But also they don't necessarily realize that it can be, and that it it could actually be made into a crime. And I think that it's also important to realize that most environmental law sits in the area of kind of regulation. It's very detailed, it's very specific, and it's often worked around. So corporations will kind of, they might pay lots of expensive lawyers to work out how and where they can best operate to get around these regulations. And so it's very different. For example, you can go and get a permit to frack. You just heard the guy from ReconAfrica saying, we went and we bought a license to frack. Now, he couldn't have gone and bought a license to kill hundreds of people, because that's criminal, right? But he still can get a permit to frack. And that's because those activities, or that level of potential risk and hazard, has not been put into the criminal, it's not been put below that criminal red line. So actually creating a crime around it is hugely important.
Yeah, I guess it also would permeate down to the culture level, if that's like a crime as well. By law, it also changes how people see it as well, and the perception. As bring me to my next question, like, what would an ecocide law look like?
This is it's kind of the $1 million question, in the sense that people often say, well, what exactly is ecocide and what isn't it? Now, of course, until the crime is in place in the statute, we won't have an exact definition, because that will inevitably get negotiated as the wording is debated, that is then finally agreed. However, what we do use there have been working definitions, including one that was submitted to the International Law Commission by Paul and myself in 2010. But we tend to broadly use the idea of simply mass damage and destruction of ecosystems that's widespread or severe or systematic. But putting it in place, I think what you really touched on there with the idea of the cultural perception is hugely important, because when we perceive something as being criminal, we condemn it in a moral way, and that's hugely important. And it's particularly important with environmental destruction, because that is mostly carried out by corporations. Of course, there are quite a lot of state-sponsored corporations, but it's mostly carried out by corporations. And what that means is that criminalizing that level of destruction is creates a deterrent that is potentially much more effective in a way than, say, I mean, I don't know, war crimes or genocide potentially are not subject to the same level of kind of public approval, if you like, in terms of people that might be perpetrating.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, I don't imagine that a genocidal maniac is worrying what people are thinking of them, you know, in that very specific way. I mean, we can come back to the links between genocide and ecocide later, but I think with a corporate crime like ecocide, you're looking at CEOs who actually care very much what the public thinks of them. You know, that it makes a huge difference to, you know, how their business can function, because investor confidence and shareholder confidence is absolutely paramount. And so if you're putting, you know, a CEO in potentially a similar bracket to a war criminal, then you're talking about a really serious influence on their potential business. So, you know, there is this kind of cultural shift, but I think there's also a way in which putting ecocide alongside genocide, crimes against humanity, it's firstly, it's very much justifiable in the current situation of crisis we have in the world. I mean, obviously, with genocide, you're talking about the destruction of a people in whole or in part. With ecocide, you're also talking about, you know, ultimately the ability of humans as a civilization to function at all. Because if we destroy nature to that extent, you know, then ultimately we're looking at threatening the entire species or entire civilization. And so, you know, it is on a level of seriousness that warrants being an international crime. But the other aspect of that, and I think again this comes back to the influence on the mentality, if you like, of the way we think about ourselves and the world, is that if you're putting destruction of nature up there with destruction of people, then you're saying that nature has an equivalent value, that, you know, that and it has an intrinsic value effectively, and you're potentially starting to move the sort of boundaries a bit in the mindset that we have very, very entrenched in the sort of dominant West, which is this mindset of separation and domination, you know, which is very, very embedded, and it's, you know, it's been there for centuries. You know, it's been there since Plato, you know, the ideal and the real. It's been there all through the Catholic Church, you know, the spirit and the body goes straight through to the Enlightenment. You've got reason versus emotion and nature, you know, so this kind of split, you know, the fact that we have this separation is very deeply embedded. And I think that, you know, potentially by, you know, this really quite simple legal change, there is this possibility of kind of unlocking a different way of looking at things.
Yeah, definitely. I think, I mean, you hear all these huge like CEOs of mining companies, of logging companies, like saying without any shame whatsoever about what they do. And it's okay. They just, I mean, the video at the beginning about the guy from ReconAfrica just openly and publicly saying, like, we're gonna, you know, take all this water from here. Well, you know, not explicitly, but that's what essentially he's saying, with like that, and no one, you know, bats necessarily an eyelid about it. It's so normalized, like, oh yeah, that's fine, I'm gonna clear out that whole forest to build 3 hotels, and that's it. And like you can just say it, whereas I don't, you know, on the other things which are put under a crime condition, no one would necessarily just openly say.
Absolutely. And in the same way that, you know, criminalizing ecocide is not necessarily going to fix everything overnight, in the same way as, you know, I mean, theft is a crime, murder is a crime. It doesn't actually completely prevent those things from happening, but it puts them in a bracket where they are condemned and where they cannot openly be pursued, which actually is hugely important, because if you don't have that, there's no way you're going to ever stop it. You know? So, you know, it's a really, really important step and a kind of foundational piece that isn't currently there. I mean, if you look at human rights, for example, and, you know, if you're campaigning for human rights or social justice, you know, of course, there's a long way to go before we have a completely fair and just world. But at least you know that murder is illegal. At least you know that mass torture and mass killing are not permitted by law. So you've got some kind of foundation on which to work. But if you're working in environmental protection and conservation, you know, certainly on the criminal law side of things, that protection isn't there. So, you know, you can have regulations that are supposed to protect, but if you don't have some kind of, you know, criminal law that acts as a guardrail, if you like, as a kind of parameter that to keep people within a certain area of safe practice, then it's very difficult to really make headway. And I think I find it hard to imagine how we're going to meet things like, or how countries are going to meet their Paris goals, or how we're going to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, you know, if this rule isn't put in place. Because if we don't put something like this in place, then Mr. ReconAfrica can just carry on, you know, crowing about, you know, his conquest of this beautiful, I mean, it's extraordinary video with these beautiful landscapes, and this guy sitting in a TV studio saying, oh, we've identified somewhere where we can go in and destroy them. You know, it's insane.
There's many things about that video that are just so like yeah. So I was thinking, I guess that's like why law is hugely important. That's why it needs to be there. And I think sometimes like people don't necessarily assign to it the critical role that it plays. I was, you know, wondering like how is, you know, those laws like put into place? Like, do you think we need, you know, more protest groups backing that up? Is it a process that, you know, people need to fight for this ecocide law to happen? Or is it something, you know, a top-down thing that only specialized like lawyers can do? Like, how
I love that question, because I think it brings us really to the crux of this, because actually it's really important that this is called for and demanded at a grassroots level. And one of the things that we've really seen over the last year in particular is that where we've got on the ground campaigns, and we've got them in 6 countries now, we're also seeing traction at the political level. So it makes a big difference that it's being discussed at grassroots level, and also just on the really sort of macro scale, you know, until, you know, Polly and I and others have been just talking about ecocide for many years, but it's only in the last year to year and a half that the term and the concept are really gaining traction. And I would say that is a large part to do with the climate mobilizations that we've seen, whether that's the school strikes led by Greta, whether that's the Extinction Rebellion and the sort of, you know, the on the ground disruptive actions that have taken up lots of column inches in the news. You know, the Sunrise Movement in the US, you know, all of these climate mobilizations have made a huge difference, because what they've done is they've pushed open the window of conversation so that the mainstream is willing to discuss the level of crisis, or at least start to approach the level of crisis that we know is happening and that scientists have known is happening for some time. And so that protest and that mobilization is actually fundamentally important. And while of course, you know, there are plenty of laws that do happen from the top down, when you look back in history at the ones that have really made a difference in terms of human rights, in terms of whether that's, you know, the abolition of slavery, whether that's votes for women, whether that's the civil rights movement, you know, they have all had huge grassroots mobilizations that have then been kind of echoed, if you like, in a legal change. And so, you know, the two things are really strongly interlinked. And actually, the Stop Ecocide campaign, or the foundation, in fact, we find ourselves in this really interesting position, because we're kind of in between of all of these things. So we've got legal developments happening on the one hand, where we've commissioned this top panel of international criminal lawyers to draft a kind of robust definition that could be used by states to propose at the International Criminal Court. And then we're also link in with the diplomatic traction and moving the political conversation forward with parliamentarians in different countries and so on. And then at the same time, we're also involved directly with grassroots campaigning and with, you know, sort of amplifying the public narrative around this. And so we're really starting to see how those things interact. And I think that's a really huge aspect of this, because it's that combination that really drives the change forward.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's talking, I get from my personal experience, like I just, you know, especially like younger, feeling like I'm not a lawyer, I'm not, you know, I don't know about the Rome statutes or like these things that I've only just like heard about now, but it's something that instinctively just feels like, yeah, it makes sense. Of course, like, why haven't they done this earlier?
Absolutely. And I think it's really interesting because when you actually talk to people one-to-one, and we often see, we find this if we're giving talks and so on, and it is that there's this kind of almost this kind of light bulb moment where people kind of realize and sort of go, well, no, absolutely, this destruction it all has a name. It's ecocide. It's all mass destruction of ecosystems. And of course, once you understand that, once that concept lands, it lands at the same time as knowing that it's wrong and that it needs to be stopped. Yeah. So that's actually very powerful. And I think it's also what I think is also often quite inspiring is when people realize that it's actually possible, because people, like you say, most people think of law, unless you're a lawyer yourself, most people think of law as being something that is done over there by lawyers. And I don't know anything about it. And international law is even further away, and international criminal law might as well be on the moon. But in reality, it's actually possible, the route that we pursue, which is at the International Criminal Court, is actually relatively straightforward. I mean, there's a procedure for amending that statute. A state has to propose an amendment, and then you need to have a majority of members at the next meeting have to vote to put it on the table, just to say, yes, we can talk about this. And then it needs to be adopted, which will take time and negotiation, and then it needs to be ratified. But it is a very set procedure. It's not like creating something from scratch. If you're creating a law from scratch, and I think the Rome Statute itself shows this, because as I was saying earlier about how, the bit about environmental crime was dropped before it came into play. When you first create a law, you're often looking at the ones with the most influence and the loudest voices, which can also mean the ones with the most money, who get the biggest say in how those negotiations turn out. But once you have a law in place and you've got an amendment procedure, any member state of the International Criminal Court can follow that procedure. So so effectively, we first started working with Vanuatu, which is a small island state, and at the sharp end of climate change, where the possibility of kind of going underwater, and so a very real incentive to get involved in this conversation. And they have as much power as any other state to bring it forward at the International Criminal Court. And that's actually what happened in 2019. That in their official statement, at this international forum, they said, we think ecocide should be seriously discussed as an amendment to the Rome Statute. And that brought the whole question onto the international state level, where it hadn't been for 50 years. So it's really interesting to see how that can happen. And unlike, for example, the UN, at the ICC, there isn't a veto. So there's no Security Council. There's no big country that can muscle in and say, no, you can't do this. Once it's on the table, it's simply a question of recruiting the support. And what we're finding now is that more and more countries are interested in this. We've already had 6 ICC member states have expressed at government level, at some level, an interest in discussing this. And then there's parliamentarians from another 11 countries now, I think, that are interested in this definition that this panel is putting together, this group of lawyers is putting together, that can potentially be used to propose. So the conversation is accelerating really quite fast now. And we hope that what we're moving into is a kind of a space where governments will actually be embarrassed to be seen saying they don't want to talk about it. Because the situation the predicament that we're in globally is becoming so accepted and well known that any government that is actively and vocally dismissing that is going to look really, really bad. So we think that it's not going to be too long before we have kind of the weight of public knowledge on our side in that way.
Of course, and I was wondering if this ecocide law would be designed to work equally across the global north and the global south, or whether there'd be any differences.
That's really interesting, and that's it's one of the things that the drafting panel will need to be looking at as we look at the definition. And the reason I say that is because there are some countries who are kind of in the process of following the actually tragic industrialized path that the global north and west has taken, and you know, that may perhaps be wanting to say, well, hang on a minute, are you saying that, you know, you're allowed to do all of this and we're not, kind of thing, you know, that's one aspect that has to be looked at. But ultimately, whatever emerges as a definition and gets adopted at the ICC will actually apply across the board. So it's a question of, you know, what, you know, how that definition emerges, and some aspects are easier to pin down than others. So very obvious direct destruction is relatively straightforward to address, whereas, for example, the climate question is a bit more complex in terms of attribution of, you know, who's responsible for what and those kinds of things. So it's going to be an interesting journey for those lawyers to, you know, to tend to pin that down. But certainly what's interesting in that respect as well is that often the worst polluters, or the sort of instigators of the worst pollution, like the fossil fuel industry, are often also responsible for some of the worst direct ecocides. And I mean, fracking is an example of that in terms of groundwater pollution and those kinds of direct pollutions, or, you know, bills like, you know, what you know, from Deepwater Horizon to the Mauritius, but also, you know, the pollution events in the Amazon in Ecuador, for example, horrific oil pollution situations out there. So, you know, so there's a lot of direct ecocides that potentially can also have a really strong effect on the situation for fossil fuel companies too. So we're confident that whatever comes out of this is going to be pretty potent. So yeah. And I think the other thing about that, I'm pretty sure of it. Yeah, sorry, I'm pretty sure of it as well. No. Yeah, we hope so. I mean, we basically feel very strongly that this is something that's inevitable. In fact, interestingly, Polly Higgins was speaking to one of the reinsurance companies, which is those big insurers that insure the insurance companies, and this was like many years ago. But they actually said to her, "We know something like this is coming. We just don't know when." You know, and the thing is, when you look at the situation in the world, you know, do we really want to get to the point where a rule like this has to be brought in just to preserve what little life is left? No, we want it to come in earlier than that. But it means that we need people to be talking about this. And interestingly, I mean, I think one of the questions that often comes up, and I don't know whether you know, the different platforms where this is being broadcast, but people are often saying, you know, what can we do to kind of support this? And I think the very obvious one is, obviously, people can go to the website, you know, of our campaign, which is stopecocide.earth, and there's an international petition, and you can sign up to become an earth protector, which is like a paid up member, if you like, of the movement. But even if you, thanks, I've seen that's just been popped up on the video. But the most important thing is, you know, obviously join us, spread the word. But it's also, when I say spread the word, it is literally the word that is important, ecocide. It's that word and that concept which really crystallize the conversation around this. And if that conversation is happening in lots of different arenas, whether it's cultural, whether it's NGO, whether it's grassroots, whether it's, you know, political level, you know, business, all of these things, because it's when that conversation gets loud enough that the change starts to accelerate, and that's what we're starting to see. So it's really, really important that that word and that concept get out there in the loudest possible way. So that's really what, you know, all of us have networks. They may be small networks, they may be big networks, but we all have networks, and we can all, you know, bring this concept in. So, you know, if let's say, I mean, I don't know, you know, people might be involved in all sorts of different things, but there may be, for example, publications that they like to read in their area, and it's like maybe submitting a blog that talks about ecocide and how it might affect or influence in that area is a very concrete way, for example, of expanding that conversation.
Yeah, I think there's something I felt like really powerful about the word itself, about naming that destruction, about like putting it, encapsulating it in there. There's something really powerful in being able to name that. And I remember, well, I did 4 years of conservation biology and ecology at university, and I never came across that word, for example.
Did they not use it at all?
no, at all.
You see, I
at
find
least in the modules I teach. Yeah. And it's like how, you know, we were essentially sort of trying to study or work out how to stop ecocide, maybe, or understand it, and even like that's, you know, why we were there. We were there because of that, but it was never really named as that, and I never thought about it as a concept either necessarily, and it just normalizes that destruction, you know, that it's okay, it's inevitable. We're sort of trying to kind of make it a bit less bad through this degree. And it was only it was only after I saw it really at the protest in the XR protest in April, and I saw people carrying it, and I was like, oh
yeah, no, it's really interesting, and I think that really speaks as well to another area that's really important, which is education, in the sense that, I mean, and I think you know, this is something that I've definitely seen as you know, coming up in XR events and XR conversations as well, is that, you know, what are our children being taught? You know, how much are they actually really learning at school, for example, about what's really, you know, what's really going on in the world, and the kind of bigger questions around that. You know, are we worrying about, you know, the piece of paper that we might have to display about, you know, whether we've got our GCSE and whatever it is, you know, which frankly no one's ever asked me for mine in my whole life. You know, or are we going to actually look at what are we going to do, everybody? You know, how are we going to actually deal with the situations that are upcoming in the world? And I think the, you know, bringing the concept of ecocide in at the educational level is going to be very important.
What is this thing you mentioned about the insurance is I think I'm still like that they've known this for so long, like, and they've predicted it in the models, and what I mean, I guess like it's like, well, it's frustrating. Why hasn't it been done sooner? And I mean, you've talked about that already quite a lot, and the vested interest for it not to happen. I guess I wanted to hear then, you know, who are the people who are supporting it? Like, are there any countries or organizations that are, you know, trying to push this through as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting is that I talked to a guy who was in the insurance industry not that long ago, and although, as I say, there was, you know, this conversation that Polly had some years ago, you know, I still don't think that the sort of business community has got its head around, you know, the potential of there being a criminal law parameter in all of this. So I think, I mean, the guy I was talking to from the insurance industry was asking me about risk and governance frameworks, which corporations are now using to they're sort of putting things like climate risk and so on into those frameworks to see how they affect, you know, business risk. And he said, you know, where would ecocide law fit into that? And I remember, and I kind of said, well, look, I'm not an insurance expert. I don't really know anything about risk and governance frameworks, but wherever you would put murder is where you would put ecocide. And his face just kind of went, it was almost like something went pop, because he sort of went, but that's not insurable. And I was like, well, exactly, it's not insurable, you know. And it was like, you know, you're not putting it somewhere at a level of risk. You're actually just saying you can't do that. It's criminal, you know. So that it does bring in a whole different element in that. And I think it's interesting to look at how that in practice, how that will pan out, because what we can't do or expect to do is change the law tomorrow. Because I think if we did do that, I mean, first it would be chaos, because obviously you'd be criminalizing an enormous number of corporate actors very quickly. You would also, you know, you'd obviously right now under lockdown, the courts are already behind with dealing with, you know, what they're trying to deal with, and trying to, you know, then deal with ecocide on top of that. And the politicians just wouldn't know where to put themselves. So no, it wouldn't be possible to do it overnight. But actually we don't want that, because the whole point in a way is this is not about, I mean, much as it's great on one level, and speaking as an activist, there are definitely some CEOs I wouldn't mind seeing in the dock. But it's not actually about that. It's not actually about putting Mr. ReconAfrica in the dock, much as that may happen, and that's quite appealing. It's actually about changing the practices so that the harm is stopped. And in order to do that, you need to see it coming. So the businesses have to see it coming. And the governments have to see it coming, which is why approaching at the international level is quite important, because it means that, you know, the new law isn't going to come in overnight, which means that, you know, governments can say, you know, we support this at the international level, and they can know that a lot of countries have to move together to make it happen. And when it does happen, a lot of countries will be doing it together. So they won't be out on a limb, you know, sort of putting at risk all their, you know, established economic relationships, if you like, and that way that you actually have the chance to kind of bring the corporate world with you, which we have to do, because everybody has to move in the same direction, you know, and it's really important that it's understood that way as something that's coming, because that way that transition period is kind of treated like a period of compliance. It's like, you know, we can't, you know, we may not know exactly the date it's coming in, but we can see that it's on the horizon. So we need to start adjusting, you know, what we do in order to meet that. And so that's a very important aspect, I think, of all this.
And I guess it gives time, to understand why. That's the thing. I think in public consciousness, sometimes, like, why are you criminalizing me now for this that I've been doing for so long and not understanding? And if you don't change that, then are you really creating any, you know, long-term change?
No, absolutely. And I think we do have to remember that you know, corporate CEOs are kind of doing what the law encourages them to do at the moment. So when you couple the kind of the culture of, you know, making money and creating wealth, which in itself is problematic, as of course XR is well aware, but if you couple that with the current laws, which support primarily maximizing return to shareholders, then what you're seeing the CEOs doing what they are employed to do. But they have to do it within certain parameters. So they can't do it while openly murdering lots of people, because that's a crime. So effectively what you're doing is you're putting an extra level into their bottom line, an extra kind of parameter that they then have to take into account. So their mission will, after that, will be, how do we, you know, maximize return for our shareholders without destroying ecosystems? And once you get businesses asking that question, you're on the right track, because effectively they're going to be taking account of that parameter. And you have to consider it as kind of like a challenge. It's like, you know, I want to kind of challenge these CEOs and say, okay, guys, you know, get your strategic thinkers together. This rule's coming in. How are you going to come out of this, you know, all shiny? How's that going to work? You know, and that will also affect. I mean, that will also affect. It will affect social justice as well. It won't just affect environmental justice, because one of the reasons, you know, these things are linked up together. And we talked about this earlier a little bit about the relationship between genocide and ecocide. And I'd like to kind of come back to that link between social justice and environmental justice, which is implied by that, because, you know, all of these extractive operations that are mostly happening, you know, across the global south or in poorer countries, often they very much go hand in hand, the damage to people and the damage to ecosystems. And so, you know, what might, for example, I mean, that might in the sort of industrialized West, you might be able to separate those a bit more obviously, so that, you know, human rights perhaps are more advanced, and so you would have ecocide as almost as this standalone thing. But often in reality, if you look at what's happening in the Amazon, you look at what's happening in parts of Africa, you know, you're actually seeing these two things happening together, because you're seeing the levels of pollution directly affecting the populations. But you're also looking, for example, if you're looking at mining operations, you may be looking at, you know, levels of safety and ways of treating people, which are both ecocidal but also hugely damaging to the people who are working there and to the local populations. So I think it's going to be very interesting when a rule of ecocide comes into play. It's like, how do you go about any kind of activity without damaging ecosystems? It will also have a knock-on effect in terms of the social justice and how people are treated as well in those areas. So I think the two things do come very much into play at the same time.
Yeah, I guess they're just like same side, like different sides of the same coin, essentially. Like there's no way you can separate people's like well-being and livelihoods and life, even no matter how many steps removed we are from that, because we might not see it here. Let's say burning like a coal power plant right here. Maybe here I'm not feeling the impacts of it, but as you said, in Tuvalu, Kiribati, people are already losing their homes right now because of like the continued burning of fossil fuels. Like people have been suffering the impacts of ecocide in their lives, like, and whole communities have ceased like to exist as they are. People have been like killed or died. I think, we were reading like one of the books I was reading, like the word like slow violence almost. Like if you sort of went to a community and you were like, I'm gonna drop a bomb and I'm gonna like 4,000 people are gonna die here, then everyone would be like, oh my God, that's like really awful. But if you take the water source or if you pollute it and then 3,000 people die alongside the course of 3 or 4 years, it's sort of like, it's not as boom, but it is the direct result of ecocide, for example, but it just doesn't, like, because it happens at different timescales, people don't see it. And I guess like the Niger Delta is like one of the like key examples of that.
Absolutely, it's horrific. It's absolutely horrific, and they've effectively been suffering ecocide for decades as a result of the the sort of slow and continual pollution of the water, the water system and the ground, and yeah, I mean that's absolutely, I mean that's a perfect example of something that could have been avoided if there had been an ecocide law in place, and of course it doesn't, it's almost like it's a first step. It's a really key step, but it is a first step. I mean, I've just been reading this, in fact, look, I've got it here. I've just been reading this rather brilliant book called Blood and Earth, Modern Slavery, Ecocide and the Secret to Saving the World. And he talks about how slavery, which still exists, I mean, as a proportion of the global population, it's smaller than it's ever been, but it still thrives in a whole number of areas of the world, and often in these extractive industries. And what I found sort of gobsmacking was this figure that he gave, where he said that if you put all of slavery together, you'd have an economy the size of, I don't know, I think he said California or one of the American states, but he said you'd have the CO2 pollution that's only third after the US and China.
Wow.
Because the operations, the slavery operations are so filthy in terms of the pollution that they create and the way that they are carried out, that the environmental impact is wildly disproportionately high. So, and it's also just really shows that the deep linkage between the social justice and environmental justice, that where there's the deterioration of the one, and you have this kind of resource curse, if you like, that you can end up with these situations where you've got both slavery and ecocide. And slavery, of course, is already illegal, and ecocide needs to be made illegal as a first step towards then going on to tackle these really, persistent cases where so many people are suffering and the environment is suffering as well. So but it's very hard to tackle that without having that ground rule in place. So that it really kind of underlines to me the need for that as well. And but addressing it just goes to show that addressing slavery is modern slavery is still absolutely paramount if we want to deal with ecocide as well. So
yeah. I guess I was wondering if an ecocide law were now, like in the case of the Okavango Delta, what would that mean, I guess, in particular for this case, or even for the activists on the ground who are
you have a very different situation from the beginning in terms of what the extractive industries would be, what the oil companies would be looking at in terms of the possibility for extraction. I mean, there's so much. I mean, this kind of law, I mean, if we look at the Rome Statute that governs the international laws, there's a whole section that describes the knowledge requirement that you have to have in order to be guilty of a crime under that statute. Mm-hmm. So basically, you have to either have intended it. I mean, obviously, the act that you do has to be intended, even if the result isn't. But you also, there's a requirement, where you knew or you should have known what it could lead to. And so what you'd be looking at is, I mean, there's now really quite a large body of evidence to show that fracking operations have a huge failure rate in terms of safety, and they have a huge pollution rate in terms of chemical pollution, light pollution, noise pollution, and groundwater pollution, and so on. And then, of course, the having to deal with the waste products, and also and the use of water and so on as well, and the fact that those things then end up effectively there as huge pollutants. So you'd have to be seriously considering, if you were a CEO, about wanting to engage in this. You'd have to seriously consider, some way down the line, am I going to be on the line for ecocide? Because how can I do my operation so that I am not creating ecocide? And certainly the evidence with fracking shows that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of wells required to actually make them economically viable, like a fracking field. Yeah. So they might talk about it as a little well here or there, and you'd hardly notice, and the well pads are only but actually you need thousands of them to actually make them work. And even when they're first built, they have something like a 6 to 10% failure rate. Now you multiply that by your thousands of wells, and how are you going to avoid having an ecocide? So those things would all have to be taken into account. So and you could link that back to the UK, for example. I mean, in fact, with the fracking, they did exactly this. I mean, you probably remember, in the media, they talked about it as, it'll just be this little well here or there. They never talked about what it's like when something like this goes into production. And of course, somewhere like the UK it's like, how would you even do that without sort of obliterating towns and villages anyway? But but also it's also a question of kind of scale. So we're looking at, if you're going to make an international crime of destruction of nature, it does have to be at a level that warrants it being an international crime. There are, of course, local kinds of laws that should and are not always well applied, but creating this kind of overview of the really serious destruction would affect something like, I would be really surprised if it didn't affect something like HS2, for example. Because if you were talking about damaging one woodland, then perhaps you could argue that it wasn't an ecocide. But HS2 has got, it's programmed to affect over 100 irreplaceable ancient woodlands, and so you're looking at. I mean, it's like the fracking thing, where you have a massive field in order to make it work. For this project to be completed, it involves a vast amount of destruction of ecosystems. It's very hard to see how that would not be an ecocide. So that's another example of something that potentially could be actively prevented. A law like this being in place.
Is there a room, I guess, we're part from Extinction Rebellion, live streaming here, a demand like the citizens' assemblies, that a role that it could play into all of this?
Absolutely. I think this is going to be absolutely key, because it's such a no-brainer on one level, that actually, if you ask the people, the response in terms of criminalizing ecosystem destruction is always really strong. And actually, there's a very concrete example of this in France, because which is almost turning out as a bit of a pilot scheme for ecocide law. It's interesting. But for example, a year and a half or so ago, there was the situation in France where the government's climate policies were being protested and that was that whole Gilets jaunes situation, where there was a fuel hike in order, and it was a climate policy effectively that was massively objected to. And the response from the government was to say, well, if you don't like our climate policies, why don't you come up with your own? And they basically convened a randomly selected citizens' assembly to come up with climate policies. And what was the top most popular climate policy? Create a law of ecocide. And so that actually kind of cornered President Macron into supporting a crime of ecocide. Because effectively, he'd convened this assembly and they came back and said, well, okay, do this. And so I think what we're seeing is that, in fact, citizens' assemblies are going to be absolutely key in this, because when you look at the perspectives of different sectors of society, it's the politicians who are lagging behind. If you have
definitely.
You don't need to give someone that much information for them to understand deeply and intuitively that ecocide should be a crime. And of course, if you talk to the scientific community, they've known the crisis that we're in. Many of them have known the crisis that we're in for decades. And the majority of the scientific community have known for many years already. And, as Greta Thunberg's always say, just listen to the science, and it's the politicians that we're needing to kind of bring with us. So I think that, the more we're able to consult the people and the more the voice of the people is amplified, the faster this will happen. And I think France is a brilliant example of that.
Yeah, I didn't know that. It's really cool. I guess ultimately the real, the power to change things is, in the people. The answers are there. And even as you said, talking to a child, you don't need a PhD necessarily to know about this. I think it's something that is quite common sense. You talked about your kids, and I've seen it with my younger cousin. He's 6, 7, and I remember he was getting really worried that paper came out of trees, and he just learned that we get oxygen from them, and he's like, wow, there's so much paper. And I know paper's not necessarily a thing, but he just made that connection in his head so fast. If we cut down trees, what about our oxygen? And I mean, he's just 5 or 6. I'm like, you don't really need a PhD or anything from Oxford or Harvard to know this. And
Absolutely.
I mean, you said talking to people is quite straightforward. It's just whether the vested political interests up there and the way that power is distributed and stuff.
And I think so much of it is around fear, because I think there's an interesting thing that I noticed the other day. Actually, I was trying to find an image I was just Googling and trying to find an image that encapsulated the idea of agency, the idea that we have the power to act. And it was really, really difficult. It was really difficult to find it. I could find images of protest really easily. I could find images. I could even find images of, healing, or images of just the ability to act, of agency, of somebody, in their kind of power, if you like, was really hard to find. And it made me think about the fact that we're often kind of acculturated to sort of attempting to maybe be a slightly shinier cog in a big machine. And, that there are certain steps we have to go through, or we have to ask permission for everything, or we have to, get approval, or, there's a sort of sense of hierarchy, all of these things that kind of play into our playing small. And, I think that, and this is one of the areas where I think activism is so important, because often the thing that breaks people out of that sort of very slow moving, bureaucratically heavy kind of system. The thing that breaks people out of that is a sense of outrage, is the sense of, often it is anger or it's outrage that kicks people into a kind of, oh my God, I have to do something, and then there's this sort of sense that's, that potentially there is something that can be done. And I think XR has done an amazing job for a lot of people of sort of breaking that mold. But what's interesting is it doesn't, action isn't necessarily, it could be taking to the streets, and it's very important that people do take to the streets. But even in their own areas of work or of life, people are often very timid and tentative about actually doing stuff. you know, actually kind of going, how do I get from A to B? Well, I need this ingredient, this is what I've got. How can I put them together to get where I want to go? You know, and actually empowering people to do that, I feel is a really big part of the journey that we're on culturally. And you know, I sort of feel like if I can leave people with one thing, it's that kind of sense, you know, of being, you know, if actually, yes, we can, well, you know, I can do something. And, you know, for me, that's about, you know, what is the thing that really pisses you off? Because that's going to be the area you want to work in. And then what is the thing you're good at? Because you apply that to the other and you've got some action, you know, and it's kind of getting out of that sort of, there's that. I think we kind of, and I don't even think it's, you know, individuals who do this. I feel like there's a kind of culture.
It's very systematized, I guess. Is all set up so that you don't feel like you can actually do something, or as you said, all the bureaucracy and all the hierarchy, like you don't know. And I think it gets really instilled from when you're very little, the way like school is structured, for example, from that, and it just trains you up to that essentially. I mean, I was just thinking how if essentially like something like ecocide was, you know, taken seriously and made into law, like the world that we live in today, especially, you know, places like the UK or many parts of Europe, our life would be radically, completely different. It'd have to, if it was like so much of our day-to-day is based on ecocide, essentially, on extractivism. And I think I'm just trying to imagine how that, like, it just look completely different, and many things that we do just wouldn't be the same. Like, and I wonder, like buying, you know, a new pair of shoes every single day, or stuff from Primark all the time, and things like that, you know. That
I mean, it's interesting. We often get asked, you know, am I committing ecocide by driving my car? You know, would I then be a criminal? Well, I mean, the straight answer to that is no, because the whole concept of ecocide, particularly as an international crime, it, you know, is aimed at the controlling minds. It's not aimed at the end user or the citizen or the consumer, because that's, you know, I mean, for example, I mean, I live in the countryside and I therefore drive a car, and it's a fossil fuel car because I can't afford anything else. Now, I try and drive as little as possible, and, you know, I don't buy any new vehicles or anything like that, but I'm driving a fossil fuel car, and that's because that's the option that's made available to me. Now, and those decisions for what options are available to citizens don't come from citizens. They come from the highest levels of government and industry, which are often hand in glove. So, you know, effectively what you're aiming at, I mean, a bit like with genocide, you're not aiming at the foot soldiers, you're aiming at the people that give the orders. So, and it would be the same thing with ecocide. So, you know, for example, I mean, there are some areas that would be hugely affected in terms of, you know, overall culture. Like, for example, you know, we would inevitably end up eating less meat. We already, you know, we eat more meat than we need to. I mean, from a perspective of, you know, the ecosystems and you know, ecocide generally, you know, the big agribusiness is a massive contributor to, you know, to ecocides, you know, whether that's the factory farming industry, you know, in many different parts of the world. And for example, with deforestation, you're often looking at a double whammy, in the sense that you're looking at the cutting down of trees, and then you're looking at the, you know, the cattle ranching and soya farming and so on. That, you know, all three of those things have an impact on climate, for example. So, you know, it's there would definitely, ultimately, there would be changes, but you know, there's so many advances in you know, around sort of food technology and around things that can enable people to eat differently and live differently. And I think, you know, this is, it's going to be a very interesting few years, I think, because I think what we're going to be looking at is, what are the ways that we can adapt? You know, what are the ways that we can, and just in our own lives or in our own communities, our own businesses, it's like, how can we be, you know, earth protectors, which is what we call our paid up members. You know, how can you be protecting the earth? How can you be avoiding ecocide in the things that you decide as a local council, for example, or the things that you decide as a university, or the things that you decide to do as a company. And, you know, there are more and more kind of groups that are focusing around this. I mean, you know, in the corporate world, you've got the B Corps that are starting to move in that direction, you know, and then, yeah, there's a whole number of different kinds of resilience and regenerative approaches that are beginning to be, you know, to come into play. And obviously what we feel is that a law of ecocide would actually really support those changes, because it would level the playing field for those people that are doing the right thing, because at the moment they're competing with the people that are doing it cheap and dirty. You know, so it could make a really big difference in that way.
It's like not destroying like the planet or like life support systems is actually quite hard. They just make it really, really hard to not do that.
Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah, no, that's right. No, it's because the rules aren't in place. And I mean, I was listening to somebody the other day. It might have been Nigel Topping actually, who was talking about the race to zero. But yeah, it was a question of describing the economic players or the corporations as kind of players of a game, and the laws as the rules of the game. And I think it's time that we need to focus more on the rules, on the really basic rules of the game. So that, because at the moment, for example, all the COP talks have been focused around ambition and how can we, what is the goodwill and the ambition that we can put into this, which is about how you play the game. It's not about the actual rules of the game. So moving it across to the level of what you are and aren't allowed to do is a sort of different perspective, I think.
Yeah, and so I'm just like thinking about it all. I wonder what any plans are there now for Stop Ecocide campaign, especially leading up to COP, and yeah, how are your feelings towards that? Are you hopeful, or what's there in the future?
Yeah, no, I mean, we're certainly very optimistic in the sense that, as I say, this whole conversation has been accelerating at a pace we couldn't have anticipated about a year ago, given where we'd got to at that point. So, yeah, I mean, what we are aiming to do over the next year particularly is really amplify this conversation. So we absolutely intend to be present in some form at the COP in quite a big way. And that's obviously somewhere where you've got state representatives all in one place, which is really useful if those are the people you're trying to reach. And in a way, for us, it's a little bit of a sort of signposting situation. We're kind of saying, yes, obviously we need all, we need improved ambition, we need all these things, but the COP talks have hitherto had a bit of a reputation for being sort of corporate sponsored and corporate focused. And what we also want to be saying there is saying, actually the real power to, a really essential part, if you like, of moving in the direction that you're all saying you want to go in is putting the right rules in place. And for that, you need to look across to The Hague, to the International Criminal Court, which does also have an annual meeting, but it's a lot smaller than the COP talks. The COP talks include, big delegations from all these different countries, and particularly the ones that can afford it. Yeah. Whereas in the ICC, it's not so many people take notice of that, and yet there's this potential there to really create a game-changing rule.
Yeah, well, we should definitely will be supporting that and protesting and putting pressure, to make that conversation and yield the results as those.
Absolutely. I mean, we hope. I mean, we obviously there's no guarantees when the work's on the diplomatic level. There's no guarantees, but we're aiming for potentially by maybe as early as next year, having a group of states that might be willing to actually propose this amendment at the international level, which would be hugely exciting. So, and of course, the more people that talk about it and the more people that pressurize their own governments to support this at the international level, the faster that will move. So, yeah.
I guess this is my last question, sorry. I guess how has the pandemic affected or shifted your plans
That's a really good question. It's been very interesting because, I mean, it's been horrific, obviously, for huge numbers of people. But it's had sort of two silver linings for this particular campaign. One of them is that it's meant that we've been able to be present at events that we probably couldn't have reached if they were all in person. So because everything's gone online, being able to be present, and it's actually, in a way, on that level, it's been a bit of an equalizer. You know, everybody's equal on a screen. You know, it's not like you have a podium in the same way as you do at these big international conferences. So that's one aspect, and it's allowed us to, you know, access in a way to more conversations in more different platforms than we would normally have been able to do. So that's been really, really interesting. The other thing, which I think is massive, and it's really shown, is that we used to get people saying, well, this will take ages to do, and you know, it's too ambitious, it'll take too long, and you know, governments won't act fast enough. Now, if there's one thing that the pandemic has shown, it's that governments can act very fast if they need to. And so, you know, and I think, and it's been interesting. There's been a number of people commenting on this, including Greta Thunberg, saying, you know, if you're going to treat the pandemic as a crisis, why don't you treat the climate as a crisis and act accordingly? Because actually what you've shown is that you can take that action if you need to. And actually, legally speaking, you know, any country can put emergency laws in place overnight if they want to. And indeed, in some countries, they have done, in order to supposedly deal with the pandemic. So I think that there's a couple of very strong you know, positives that have come out of it for the Stop Ecocide movement. And I think the other thing that has really emerged as well is that the two things are linked. So, you know, the fact that we are destroying natural habitats is actually creating an opportunity for these kinds of diseases to, you know, to jump to human populations, and for, you know, the increased likelihood of pandemics grows with the continued destruction of nature. So that also, in terms of the narrative of how we're explaining what we're doing, it's brought it home to a lot of people. So that's also been one of the upshots of it.
I guess it's quite unfortunate that it sort of has to get to something like this that affects the global north quite a lot, because as we said, ecocide has already had huge tolls, like in the global south especially, and that it takes something like this that shakes, you know, the powerhouses of like Europe and stuff to be like, oh my god, maybe we should take this a bit more seriously.
Absolutely. And there's always this sense of, there's a sort of almost a sort of bittersweet flavor to for us to all of this, because the worse things get in the world, the more people listen to us. So it's like, so, you know, you kind of find yourself, you know, kind of going, should I be celebrating this, or should I be, you know, it's a bit of a strange position to find yourself in. But on the other hand, you know, is that tragic thing of people, until something's right in front of them, they find it difficult to act on it. So, you know, let's just hope that what we're seeing around the world right now is actually going to galvanize the action that's needed to, you know, to get this on the table.
Yeah, well, I hope so too. And everyone watching this, I guess that's a decision that all of us like make. So, you know, I'll decide to take action about it. And yeah, it's been really nice to hear from you, by the way, and learn all about this. I'm sure there's many more things to hear from you. But yeah, really appreciate, especially with COVID. I know it can be quite, you know, stressful to be on Zoom all the time, but thank you so much for your time.
Oh, you're so welcome. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on. Thank you.
And we've got a petition, you know, I encourage everyone watching this to go, you know, as Jojo mentioned, go to stopecocide.earth, sign the petition, talk about it with your friends, with your family, with your neighbors, with your dog, with your cat. Just get it out there, and I think organize and act, and
and contact your elected representatives as well. You know, create a bit of pressure politically too. Amazing.
Yeah, and like that, these decisions do affect like people's lives, like globally, like people, you know, like Ina, for example, that we've just seen in the videos above, like it's people's lives who's like these decisions that we make will affect and make a difference to them. So
absolutely. And I got one, I'd love to just say to Ina and all those working with her as well, you know, keep on fighting, because it really does make a difference. And, you know, I mean, in the UK, it was, you know, years and years of on the ground action against fracking that had a massive impact on delaying operations here, to the extent that it became completely economically unviable to even continue with the whole production of unconventional oil. So keep at it. You're absolutely, I'm just with you 100%.
Yeah, and I think it's good to see people, you know, as in our first live stream, like this is a global system, and it will, you know, a global system that's causing this. And it therefore requires a globally, internationally organized response, like fighting from many different fronts, you know, from the person in the ground on the front line to, for example, people like you trying to change international law. And, you know, there's many different sides from which to fight that. Yeah, finally, also, everyone encourage you to see the link to sign the petition to stop the drilling in the Okavango Delta. That's really important. And I guess, yeah, we have a little video right at the end, if I'm not mistaken. And yeah, thank you all for watching this, being here with us. And next week, we're gonna be hearing from Esther, Stanford-Xosei, talking about reparations, because as we mentioned, ecocide, genocide, something that has been going on for quite a while. And it's, you know, there's also needs to be a conversation about what repair is done to the harm that's already been perpetrated. So thank you all and everyone.